All right, so everyone's talking about this whole Russia-Belarus nuclear thing, and you wonder what the big deal is? Well, we took a deep dive into this Newsweek article and a Reddit discussion about it on Stirred World News to really break it down. So basically, think of this deep dive as like your cheat sheet for figuring out just what's in this pact, why everyone's freaking out, and what it means for the future. Newsweek does a good job of laying out the basics. Putin goes to Belarus, signs this treaty, talks about giving them security guarantees.
I gotta be careful with that phrase, especially with what this pact actually allows.
Totally right. We're talking about potential use of Russian nukes that are already in Belarus. Like this agreement basically paves the way for those to be used if there's an attack. Putin even said, I'm sure that the treaty will ensure the security of Russia and Belarus.
That's where that whole security guarantees thing gets interesting. I mean, what does that even mean in this context? Is this something completely new compared to their old agreements? Or is this just classic Putin, playing his games?
Right. It definitely feels like part of a bigger pattern, especially since this pact comes after Putin updated Russia's entire nuclear doctrine.
Yeah. And that update is a big deal. You really need to understand that to grasp how serious this is. See, before, Russia's doctrine was all about deterrence, using the threat of nukes to stop attacks in the first place. The logic was, no one's going to attack them because they know Russia could retaliate. Mutually assured destruction, MAD.
So they're basically like the ultimate insurance policy. Don't use them unless absolutely necessary, and hope you never have to.
Exactly. But this new doctrine, it kind of throws that out the window. Now they're saying they might use nukes, even if they're attacked with conventional weapons, like no nukes involved, if it's from a country that's allied with a nuclear power.
So even being friends with a country that has nukes could be enough to get a nuke thrown your way? That's wild.
It is. It's incredibly volatile, creates so much ambiguity, makes miscalculations and escalation so much more likely. It's a whole different approach to nuclear weapons than what we've seen before. And we really need to understand why Putin's making this shift now.
Yeah, the timing is definitely interesting, especially with everything going on in Ukraine.
Right. The war in Ukraine is definitely a major factor here. Putin's feeling the pressure, and this could be his way of trying to scare the West into not helping Ukraine. It's a huge gamble, though.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of gambles, there's this other fascinating detail in the Newsweek article. Apparently, Lukashenko took advantage of this treaty signing to give Putin his wish list.
Oh, yeah. The Oreshnik missiles.
The Oreshnik missiles, what are those?
They're intermediate-range ballistic missiles. They have a much longer range than the tactical missiles we've been seeing in the conflict in Ukraine. Tactical missiles are for the battlefield. Oreshniks are for reaching deep into enemy territory.
Okay, so definitely not the kind of missiles you want pointed at you. So what happened? Did Putin just say yes?
Well, he said they could be deployed by the second half of 2025, but they'd stay under Russian control. The interesting part is that Belarus gets to pick the targets.
Hold on. They get to tell Russia where to point these new, scary missiles. Wow, that's a really interesting power dynamic. Is Belarus trying to flex a little, or is Russia still calling all the shots?
It's a good question. Are they asserting themselves, or are they becoming more and more reliant on Russia? Well, I don't want to say puppet state just yet.
Yeah, the power dynamics are definitely complicated. But what about the Belarusian people? Do they get any say in this at all? Newsweek did quote Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. She's the exiled opposition leader.
Right. She had some pretty strong words about the agreement.
Yeah, she basically called Putin out, saying, Putin's visit to Minsk isn't about security, it's about Russia tightening control over our country. The deployment of new weapons and using Belarus as a pawn in his imperial ambitions threatens us all.
It's a powerful statement. And it raises an important question. How much support does she really have within Belarus? Is this a fringe view, or is there more widespread dissent?
That's the thing. Lukashenko's been in power a long time, and he's not exactly known for being tolerant of different opinions, so it's hard to say what the public really thinks.
Yeah.
We wanted to get a sense of what everyday people are saying, so we checked out that Reddit thread on Row World News. And let's just say, the reaction was not exactly positive. Lots of colorful language being used to describe Putin and Lukashenko.
What kind of language?
Well, Puppet Master and Mini-Me were pretty popular, which kind of gives you a sense of the overall sentiment. But beyond the name-calling, there's a lot of concern that Belarus is essentially becoming a puppet state, and this nuclear pact is just the latest proof.
It is interesting how online spaces like Reddit can sometimes reflect public opinion, even if they don't always capture the full picture. So do these reactions reflect any bigger geopolitical concerns, or is it just people venting online? There were some comments that actually pointed out some possible benefits for Belarus in this whole thing.
Really? Like what? I must have missed those.
Some people were arguing that this pact could actually make Belarus more secure, like it could deter NATO countries from attacking. The logic is, if Belarus is under Russia's nuclear umbrella, attacking Belarus would be like attacking Russia itself.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it seems like a risky bet, like putting all your eggs in one basket
Yeah.
and hoping that Russia would actually risk a nuclear war to defend you.
Yeah, and it also assumes that NATO countries are even thinking about attacking Belarus, which, let's be real, seems pretty unlikely.
Right. That whole NATO is out to get us thing feels a bit like an excuse.
It does, but it's a narrative that Putin's used very effectively to consolidate his power and justify his actions.
It's like making up a monster
And-
and then using that fear to control everyone.
Exactly, and it's dangerous because it creates this tension, this volatile environment
Agree.
where miscalculations and escalation are much more likely.
So not exactly a recipe for peace and stability.
Nope. But it's important to remember, things are rarely black and white, especially in geopolitics. There are always different perspectives, competing interests. Belarus is definitely in a tricky situation.
Yeah. It's like they're walking a tightrope, trying to stay somewhat independent, but also aligning themselves with Russia. And with those Oreshnik missiles looming in the background, that tightrope is starting to feel very shaky.
It's a delicate balancing act,
Yeah.
and who knows how long they can keep it up. But I think it's time to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. So for someone trying to understand this whole Russia-Belarus nuclear situation, what's the most important thing to take away?
I think you said it earlier when you were talking about Putin's updated nuclear doctrine. This pact seems to be a pretty clear sign that Russia is moving away from that whole nuclear weapons are only for deterrence idea.
Exactly. That's what makes this so significant. This isn't just about Belarus. It's about a fundamental shift in Russia's nuclear posture. It shows that Putin's willing to use nuclear weapons as a tool to intimidate and coerce, even if it means increasing the risk of a catastrophic conflict.
So basically, that line between conventional war and nuclear war is becoming more and more blurred.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for global security. A lot of people are comparing this to the Cold War, and there are definitely parallels. But the world is much more complicated now. There are more players. And the stakes are even higher. The potential consequences of a nuclear conflict today are even more devastating than they were back then.
Wow. That's a sobering thought.
Mm-hmm.
So what should people be watching for as this situation develops?
I think it's crucial to pay attention to how other countries react, especially NATO members.
I mean, how they respond to this pact.
Yeah.
And the potential deployment of those Oreshnik missiles.
Exactly. Are they increasing their military presence in the region? Are they imposing new sanctions on Russia or Belarus? Are they engaging in diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation? These are all signs of how seriously they're taking this threat.
And I imagine Ukraine's response will be especially important. They're the ones on the front lines of this whole conflict.
Absolutely. Ukraine's perspective is essential to understanding the full scope of the risks. They have the most to lose if things escalate.
It's like we're watching this high-stakes chess match. And every move could set off a chain reaction. We need to pay attention to how everyone responds to Putin's latest move. Wow, this deep dive has been intense. And we've only scratched the surface.
We have. That's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. We start with one topic, and suddenly we're down this rabbit hole of interconnected events and implications.
Which brings me to a final question. It wasn't explicitly mentioned in the Newsweek article or the Reddit thread, but it's something I keep thinking about.
What is it?
If Belarus gets to choose targets for those Oreshnik missiles, like Newsweek mentioned, what does that say about the potential for miscalculation or escalation?
That's a good question.
It seems like Putin's trying to maintain some control.
Right.
He's not just handing over the nuclear keys to Lukashenko.
Yeah.
But even giving Belarus a limited say in targeting adds a whole new level of complexity.
It does. What happens if Belarus chooses a target that Russia thinks is too provocative? Or what if there's a miscommunication? Or a disagreement about the strategic value of a target? It's easy to imagine how things could quickly spiral out of control.
It's like adding another cook in the kitchen. And this cook might have a completely different idea of what should be on the menu.
Exactly. And when you're dealing with nuclear weapons, even the smallest miscommunication can have devastating consequences.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what Lukashenko's thinking. Is he picturing specific targets? Or is this just a power move, like trying to feel like he's got more control than he actually does?
That's a good point. Maybe he's thinking strategically, trying to use this whole situation to strengthen his position.
Right, but that assumes he actually understands the risks.
Yeah. What if his idea of a threat is different from Russia's? What if he misjudges the situation and goes too far? We're talking about nuclear weapons here. There's no room for error. Exactly. And who knows how Putin would react if Lukashenko steps out of line? This whole thing could easily backfire on Belarus, make them even more dependent on Russia, and maybe even drag them into a war they can't control.
That's what's so scary about this whole pact. It's not just about the weapons themselves, it's about the people in charge and what their goals are. It really makes you realize that global security often comes down to the decisions of a few individuals.
It does. It highlights how important diplomacy is and communication, and really understanding how complicated these situations are. We can't just focus on the weapons, the missiles and warheads. We have to understand the human element, the political calculations, the potential for misunderstandings and misjudgments.
It's like a game of chess, but instead of pawns, the players are holding live grenades.
That's a pretty intense analogy.
But it feels accurate. I think we've given our listener a lot to think about today. This Russia-Belarus nuclear pact is a complicated issue with big implications. We've covered the details of the agreement, analyzed why the players might be doing what they're doing, and considered what it means for the world.
We've also emphasized how important critical thinking is, questioning what you hear, and being aware of biases in the information you come across.
Exactly. That's a great takeaway. Don't just accept the headlines. Dig deeper. Consider different viewpoints and ask the tough questions.
Because when the stakes are this high, we can't just sit back and watch. We all have a part to play in creating a safer and more secure future.
Well said. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and as always, stay curious.